April 12, 1945. As the British 11th Armoured Division pushes deep into collapsing Germany, two Wehrmacht officers approach under a white flag. This is not a surrender. It's an unprecedented proposal, a local truce. They offer to hand over a nearby camp, Bergen-Belsen, without a single shot fired. But their offer comes with a chilling warning. The camp, they claim, is consumed by a massive typhus epidemic. If the British attack, its SS guards will desert, and 60,000 infected prisoners will flood the countryside, unleashing an uncontrollable plague. The British advance is suddenly halted by an unthinkable dilemma. This decision thrust the British into a reality of war for which no soldier is ever trained. The mission was no longer about defeating an enemy army, but about entering a city of the dead and dying. These were men hardened by combat, now ordered to become medics, policemen, and burial details, all at once in the middle of hell. The question at the heart of this story is not how a battle is won. It's what happens when soldiers, bound by discipline, are forced to police the perpetrators of an unimaginable atrocity, while simultaneously trying to save their victims, all under a fragile, temporary truce. To understand the impossible position they were in, we must first examine the bizarre agreement they were about to make. For the commanders of the British 8th Corps, the German proposal was a strategic and moral minefield. Their primary objective, ordered from the highest levels of Allied command, was speed. The 11th Armored Division was the tip of a spear aimed at the Elbe River, a vital artery they needed to sever to split the remaining German forces and prevent the Nazi government from forming a new defensive line. Every tank, every truck, and every hour was committed to this final, decisive push. A halt, even for a day, could compromise the entire operation. The German offer forced an impossible choice upon Lieutenant General Evelyn Barker. To ignore the warning was to risk a public health catastrophe, but to accept it meant diverting precious resources and creating a logistical nightmare. A 48-square-kilometer neutral zone carved directly out of their axis of advance. Formal negotiations took place over the next 48 hours. The document signed on April 12th is one of the most surreal agreements of the entire war. It stipulated that German forces would withdraw from the area, but laid out conditions that were deeply unsettling. The entire SS Guard contingent, including the camp's commandant, Josef Kramer, would be permitted to remain armed at their posts until the British arrived. Then, they were to be given safe passage back to German lines. In effect, the British Army was guaranteeing the escape of the very men running the camp. The terms grew stranger still. To maintain law and order in the interim, a contingent of armed Hungarian troops, who had been serving alongside the Germans, would remain in control of the prisoners. The British, with no intelligence on the camp's internal dynamics, agreed. They were effectively sanctioning the continued imprisonment of tens of thousands of people by an enemy force, under the authority of a British-German truce. Compounding the problem was a near-total lack of information. On British military maps, Bergen-Belsen was marked simply as a prisoner-of-war camp. There was no intelligence indicating it was a hub for civilians transported from across Europe. The advance units of the 11th Armored Division were combat formations, equipped with small medical detachments designed to treat battlefield wounds, not a typhus epidemic on a massive scale. They had no field hospitals, no sanitation experts, no stockpiles of food for a starving city of 60,000. All those resources were miles behind the front, struggling to keep up with the rapid advance. The clock was ticking. For 3 agonizing days, from April 12th to the 15th, the British were bound by their agreement. They knew that just a few miles away, thousands were dying from disease and starvation. Yet they could do nothing but wait. Finally, on the morning of April 15th, the truce came into effect. A small reconnaissance force from the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment, accompanied by an intelligence officer, was dispatched to enter the neutral zone and formally take control of the camp. Their orders were to secure the site, assess the situation, and report back. They expected a grim scene, sick and malnourished prisoners of war. They were soldiers, prepared for the harsh realities of a collapsing Reich. They were not prepared for Belsen. The first thing that hit them was the smell. A sweet, cloying odor of decay that clung to the air for miles. As the first scout cars of the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment rolled through the gates on April 15th, the truce they had so carefully negotiated became a meaningless piece of paper. The warning of a typhus epidemic had prepared them for sickness. It had not prepared them for this. Brigadier Glyn Hughes, the senior medical officer who entered with them, would later report, No description nor photograph could really bring home the horrors that were there. Before them lay a sprawling, silent battlefield where the fighting was already over. More than 10,000 unburied bodies, tangled in skeletal piles, lay rotting in the spring sun. And moving among them, like ghosts, were another 50,000 living souls, so emaciated they barely registered as human. One soldier would simply call them the living dead. These were combat veterans, men who had fought their way from the beaches of Normandy. They had seen death in all its violent forms. But this was different. This was not war. It was a crime scene on an industrial scale. Hardened men, who had faced machine guns without flinching, now stood openly weeping. Others turned away, physically sick. The entire framework for their mission, their military orders, their understanding of the enemy, it all evaporated in an instant. The shock was absolute. But as the initial wave of horror passed, it was replaced by a single, paralyzing question. In this boundless ocean of death and suffering, where do you even begin? The first answer to that question was simple and immediate. You begin with the perpetrators. While some SS guards had fled in the final hours, dozens remained, as per the truce agreement. The camp commandant, Josef Kramer, his deputy, and guards including the notorious Irma Greza were rounded up by British military police. For the soldiers who had just witnessed the landscape of skeletons, this was the first profound test of their discipline. The guards were not starving. They were clean, well-fed, and in some cases, openly defiant. The sight of their healthy bodies against the backdrop of mass death ignited a cold, visceral fury in the British troops. The impulse for immediate, violent retribution was overwhelming. But the orders from Brigadier Hughes and Colonel Taylor were absolute. These men and women were not to be harmed. They were prisoners, and more importantly, they were evidence. They were to be held for trial. Kramer himself seemed to exist in an alternate reality. He presented himself to the British not as a criminal, but as an administrator who had completed a difficult handover. In his mind, he had upheld his side of the truce. He had maintained what he considered order and prevented a mass escape. He was, by his own logic, an officer who had surrendered his post and expected professional courtesy, specifically the safe passage to German lines promised in the original agreement. His shock was palpable when the British commander, Derek Sington, informed him that the truce was void. Kramer and his staff were not prisoners of war. They were under arrest and would be confined within Belsen. His documented reaction was not one of guilt or fear, but of bureaucratic indignation. His carefully managed routine had been disrupted. With the guards under control, the next priority was the living. Army trucks, laden with standard rations, bully beef, biscuits, chocolate, rushed into the camp. Soldiers began handing out food and water, a desperate, compassionate reflex. But a horrifying new reality quickly emerged. The death rate did not fall. In some huts, it began to rise. The British medical officers, led by Brigadier Hughes, recognized a terrible paradox, one recently understood from studies of the 1943 Bengal famine. For a body in the final stages of starvation, a sudden intake of normal food is a death sentence. The metabolic shock, known today as refeeding syndrome, overwhelms the system, leading to heart and respiratory failure. The very act of kindness was killing them. Immediately, all food distribution was halted. A new, agonizingly slow plan was implemented, the Belsen diet. It began with nothing more than a watery vegetable soup, 1 pint a day, providing minimal calories. The plan was to increase the caloric intake by tiny increments over many days. It was medically sound. It was the only way to save lives, but it created an impossible moral situation. The British now had stockpiles of food, but they were forced to withhold it from thousands of people pleading for a piece of bread. To the starving prisoners, who could not understand the medical reasoning, their liberators appeared cruel, rationing sustenance in a place already defined by deprivation. Amid this controlled chaos, justice was a raw, contested issue. In the first few hours, in the absence of a clear command structure inside the wire, discipline frayed. Official records are sparse, but they, along with multiple eyewitness accounts, confirmed that a handful of SS guards were shot. Some were killed during altercations with vengeful prisoners. Others were shot by British soldiers, officially reported as, while trying to escape, a common euphemism for summary execution on the battlefield. But these isolated incidents, born of rage and chaos, must be separated from the myths that grew later of widespread, systematic revenge killings by the British. The command's primary focus was never vengeance. It was establishing order and gathering irrefutable proof of the crime itself. That proof was everywhere, in the thousands of corpses littering the ground. Dealing with them was both a sanitary necessity and an act of forced accountability. Colonel Taylor ordered the captured SS guards, both men and women, to be formed into burial details. They were marched out under armed guard, stripped of their well-kept uniforms, and made to carry the skeletal, decomposing bodies of their victims to massive burial pits. They were forced to do it with their bare hands. But this was not just about retribution. Watching them was Sergeant William Lawry and the cameramen of the Army Film and Photographic Unit. Every moment was documented. The defiant, healthy faces of the guards, now contorted with disgust and exhaustion. The act of lifting a skeletal child. The sheer, unending scale of the task. The burial was not just a burial. It was the deliberate collection of evidence, turning the SS themselves into the star witnesses of their own atrocities for the trials that would inevitably follow. Yet, despite these determined efforts, securing the killers, burying the dead, implementing a scientifically backed medical plan, the numbers were not improving. As the first days turned into a week, the British officers stared at their charts in disbelief. Something was going terribly wrong. The death toll inside Bergen-Belsen was not falling. It was climbing, faster than ever before. The statistics confirmed a catastrophic failure. In the week following liberation, the death rate inside Belsen climbed, peaking at nearly 500 people per day, a rate higher than in the final week under SS control. From the perspective of the dying, it was a new, incomprehensible cruelty. They saw their liberators, strong and well-fed. They saw trucks filled with food. Then they watched as their former SS guards were given full rations, while they themselves received only a single cup of watery soup. To a person who had dreamed of a crust of bread for years, this wasn't medical science. It was a betrayal. The men in British uniforms, withholding food under a new set of rules, became the camp's new guards. For the soldiers and medics, the moral certainty of their mission dissolved. They were following precise medical orders, the only path to saving lives. But in the eyes of the victims, they were becoming the new tormentors. They were met not with gratitude, but with bewildered anger and the quiet despair of those who believed rescue had arrived, only to find it look like a more organized form of starvation. The British command began to understand that to stop the dying, they had to fight not just the medical symptoms, but the system that created them. And that meant confronting its architect. In a makeshift office, Josef Kramer was brought before British military intelligence. The officers, surrounded for days by the consequences of his actions, finally confronted the man they called the Beast of Belsen. They were expecting a monster, a fanatic, a sadist. What they found was far more disturbing. He was calm, composed, indignant. According to the notes of his interrogator, Captain Paver, Kramer did not speak of murder or atrocity. He spoke of administration. He complained that his camp had been running in an orderly fashion until late 1944. The problem, he explained, was the constant arrival of transports from other camps, overwhelming his facilities. He complained about the lack of food and medicine to deal with the typhus outbreak, an epidemic that disrupted his routine. He presented himself as a manager, struggling with a logistical crisis. The tens of thousands of dead and dying were not victims of a crime. They were an administrative failure, a disruption to the paperwork. For the British officers, this was the true climax of the horror. The man responsible for this hell was not a demon from a different world. He was a bureaucrat, a functionary obsessed with process, who saw human beings as items on a ledger. This was the sickening revelation of Belsen, that an apocalypse could be unleashed not by monstrous passion, but by the dull, methodical, and profoundly ordinary work of men just like this one. And in that moment of chilling clarity, the truce from the beginning of this story reveals its true purpose. It was never a humanitarian gesture. It was a desperate, cynical act of self-preservation by a collapsing regime trying to contain the typhus epidemic of its own making before it consumed their own people. The men of the 11th Armored Division, racing towards a military objective, didn't choose this fight. They stumbled into history. They were not prepared to be liberators. They were forced to become the world's first witnesses and first responders to the industrial logic of atrocity, inventing the protocols for a situation that had no precedent. Bergen-Belsen was not a battle they won. It was a crime scene they secured. The soldiers' mission fundamentally changed. It was no longer about defeating an army, but about holding a system accountable. The evidence they gathered, the films of the burials, the medical records, Kramer's own bureaucratic testimony, became the cornerstone of the Belsen trial. A forerunner to Nuremberg, that trial would help etch the concept of crimes against humanity into the conscience of the world and into the laws of nations. The soldiers who fought their way across Germany were prepared for the costs of battle, but what they found in Bergen-Belsen taught them a truth for which no training could ever prepare them. They discovered that the opposite of war is not peace. Sometimes it is something far, far worse.